Of moral states to be avoided, there are three kinds: vice, incontinence, and brutishness. The contraries of two of these are evident. One we call virtue, the other continence. To brutishness, it would be most fitting to oppose superhuman virtue, a heroic and divine kind of virtue. As a brute has no vice or virtue, so neither has a god. His state is higher than virtue, and that of a brute is a different kind of state than vice. Here at the beginning of Book 7, Aristotle is backing off a bit and re-engaging the questions of ethics from a different perspective. Now we hear about moral states, different forms or ways of being in relation to morality. Well, at least our translator uses the word moral states here. If we wanted to go back to the old question about the relation between ethics and morality, we could notice that the Greek word translated moral here is perita ethe. That little word ethe is a root of our word ethics. Whether we prefer the language of morality or the language of ethics, and I have to admit that the latter is much more popular in our current culture, both have in view living the kind of life that is to be desired, and the kinds of actions that produce that kind of life. We've been looking at the nature of virtue and the virtues for the last several books. I think we have at least a basic grasp of what he's saying about virtue. Most of this book deals with continence and incontinence, so we'll have more to say about that later. But what about brutishness? I've checked some of the literature on the subject, and brutishness has received much less attention than the other terms and concepts in the Nicomachean ethics. We could take the thinness of Aristotle's discussion of the term and the paucity of work done on it by others as a sign that we can safely drop it and move on to the more important issue of continence. I'd like to linger here for just a moment, however, and consider it more deeply. Because I'm neither an expert on Aristotle nor fluent in ancient Greek, you might want to take my musings with at least a grain of salt, but perhaps you'll find some value in them. When we consider what Aristotle has to say about brutishness here in chapter 1 and later in chapter 5, another translation, perhaps a looser and more modern translation, could be inhumane. Brutes are animals, specifically wild animals. They lack reason. Even more, they act in ways that seem far beyond the bounds of reason. Humans become brutish when their actions and lifestyles appear to be beyond reason, completely nonsensical. Greeks like Aristotle saw these features in wild animals. That's what made them wild. Their lives were unordered, not just disordered. Greek ethnocentrism commonly led them to think of their own communities as the paradigm of civilization and rationality. Their cultures made sense. When they looked beyond their communities at non-Greeks, the peoples they called barbarians, they saw ways of living that made no sense. Those barbarians lived like wild animals, not subject to the order found in the rationality of Greek city-states. This lack of order goes all the way to their language. As they interacted with barbarians, Greeks could tell that they had languages. Their languages, however, sounded like wild animal noises, a meaningless bar, 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 bar. Considering this brief overview of a possible understanding of brutishness, has it done us any good? Compared to the ancient Greeks, we are much more knowledgeable about both wild animals and foreign cultures today. Zoologists can tell us much about the logic inherent to the ways of living of the animals they study. Cultural anthropologists can tell us much about the ways other cultures work, so much so that only the most committed ethnocentric people will readily acknowledge the inappropriateness of thinking of other cultures as barbaric, let alone brutish. Well, maybe. In times of war, we still revert to thinking of our enemies as brutish, as beyond all reason. Whether our enemies are a foreign nation or a terrorist group, or even our neighbors who hold a competing political ideology, it is easy to cast them as inhumane, as brutish, as beyond all reason. Does it help us to think that way about them? If our goal is to kill them or employ significant government resources to eradicate them or subjugate them, then it can be helpful to think of them as mere brutes. Unlike real humans, people like us, we think of them like we would think of rats and mosquitoes, a vermin to be utterly destroyed. We present them to ourselves as inhumane, giving us the perceived right to dehumanize them and destroy them. I don't see any of this strategic use of brutishness in Aristotle's discussion. He's considering brutishness as a possible human way of life, but one for us, his audience, to avoid. Well, maybe that's not quite right. Maybe I should say that for him, brutishness is a moral state not to be desired. Saying brutishness is not to be desired may be better than saying that it is to be avoided, since avoiding something implies intention, and the irrationality of brutishness seems to put it beyond intention. The contrary of brutishness, Aristotle suggests, is a state like a god's, above virtue. Adding this to our examination of brutishness, it sounds like where the brute is inhumane, the god is superhuman, not in the sense of Clark Kent's alter ego, someone entirely in the appearance of an ordinary human, but capable of feats far beyond the ordinary human, but in the sense of being beyond the human, in very logic and sense. The ways of the wild animals and the barbarians are below ours for Aristotle. The ways of the gods are above ours. The ways of the brutes make no sense and are bad. The ways of the gods also make no sense to us, but because they're gods, their ways are good and blessed. Of course, we might want to hold Aristotle's theology at a distance. His philosophical stance toward the traditional Greek gods was similar to other philosophers of his time. He might offer them honor as part of inescapable social custom, but the unmoved mover was more his conception of a real God. When we and they, the ancient Greek philosophers, read the stories of the gods, they were unimpressed with their antics. For you who are familiar with Greek mythology, how many stories are there of Zeus or some other god going out and raping human women? How many stories of the gods getting jealous of humans, of the fickleness and unreliability of the gods? But they're gods, so what they do must make sense. It's just a sense beyond our ordinary human sense. I think that's what Aristotle's getting at when he offers this as the contrary of brutishness. A last comment on brutishness before moving on. When we look at the other pairs, virtue and vice, continence and incontinence, we see options, ways of living that are available to us on both ends of the spectrum. We can be more or less virtuous and vicious, more or less continent or incontinent. Those are available moral states for us. Apparently, brutishness is available to us, most often due to severe disease or deformity, as Aristotle says at 1145a, line 31, but the contrary godlikeness is not available to us. Now, first, both continence and endurance are thought to be included among things good and praiseworthy, and both incontinence and softness among things bad and blameworthy. And the same person is thought to be continent and ready to abide by the result of his calculations, or incontinent and ready to abandon them. And second, the incontinent person, knowing that what he does is bad, does it as a result of passion. Well, the continent person, knowing that his appetites are bad, refuses on account of his rational principle to follow them. Third, the temperate man, all men call continent and disposed to endurance. Well, the continent person, some maintain to be always temperate, but others do not. And some call the self-indulgent person incontinent, and the incontinent person self-indulgent indiscriminately, while others distinguish them. Fourth, the person of practical wisdom, they sometimes say, cannot be incontinent, while sometimes they say that some who are practically wise and clever are incontinent. Again, fifth, People are said to be incontinent even with respect to anger, honor, and gain. These then are the things that are said. Let's begin with identifying key terms in this last paragraph of chapter 1. Can you see what those key terms are? Some are terms referring to states of being, some to evaluative terms. I see continence, incontinence, endurance, softness, good, praiseworthy, bad, blameworthy, passion, appetites, rational principle, temperate, self-indulgent, and practical wisdom. Some of these we've noticed before as we've been reading Aristotle. The last of these, practical wisdom, we recognize as sophrosune. Continence is enkrateia, while incontinence is akrasia. Endurance is carteria. Softness is malakia. Rational principle is logismos. You might think of our word logic there. Passion is pathos, and appetites is epithumia. Now, I bet some of you are thinking, man, why does he keep giving us all that Greek? Will I have to know it? Will it be on the test? I can tell you that I give you all the raw material you need to pass any tests in this class. I can also tell you that I detest the idea of teaching to the test, convinced that that's a way to shortchange students. Of the words I've mentioned just now, softness might be the strangest. At least it seems strange to me. In its context here and other Greek texts I'm familiar with, a better translation might be passivity. People who are soft just let things happen to them. They treat themselves as objects of the action of others, never rising to the full status of actor themselves. They not only refrain from acting according to a rational principle, they also don't take responsibility for their own actions. They may blame their DNA, their parents, their environment, the devil, the bullies around them, just about anyone but themselves. Other people make them do things. The Greeks looked down on softness, valuing the mastery of full agency. When we get to chapter 7, we'll see more about softness. There at 1150a, line 33, we'll see the soft person contrasted with the person of endurance. The person with the quality of endurance can last, can stand up under the pressure. The soft person given to passivity is prone to give in and not resist. Where do you think our culture stands in this regard? First, have you ever perceived someone who could be described as soft in this sense? If so, what do you think might lead them to have become soft? If there are such people in our culture, what does our culture have to say about them? Does it agree with Aristotelian and Greek perspective that softness is bad and to be avoided? Or maybe it disagrees, thinking that the soft are those who have been victimized through no fault of their own. Does our culture, having flipped the valuation of softness, perhaps from the ancient Greek world, valorize softness, lifting up the virtue of victimhood? Is it still a useful concept at all? Is it worth retaining in our ethical thinking? Why or why not? Continence, the main subject of this book, deals with taking the right approach when it comes to passions and desires. We exercise self-control, submission to a rational principle that enables us to say no to them. Incontinent people are, to speak metaphorically, blown here and there by every wind of passion and desire. They lack the firm sense of character, direction, and purpose that anchors them in the chaotic wind of passion and desire. The incontinent person may be weak. They'd like to resist passion and desire, but aren't able. Or maybe self-indulgent, enjoying being controlled by passion and desire. Have you ever seen continence or incontinence, whether in yourself or in others? My inclination is to think that being continent is harder than being incontinent. It's harder to resist passions and desires than it is to just give in and go with the flow. What do you think in terms of your experience and your analysis of the nature of the good life? For Aristotle, it is better to be continent than to be incontinent. Given his understanding of these terms, What advantages and disadvantages do you see in each stance? Aristotle's preference is that we do not settle for just being continent. Inasmuch as the continent person resists being controlled by passion and desire, being continent is a good thing. Aristotle sees a higher moral state, however, being temperate. The temperate person might look like a continent person from the outside. The difference is that the temperate person has learned to have different passions and different desires. The temperate person has her passions and desires directed at the right things and ordered in the right way to lead that person to become virtuous. Because the temperate person has right and rightly ordered passions and desires, these passions and desires function as an aid to living the good life, rather than as a hindrance to it. Here's how Aristotle puts it in chapter 10 at 1151b, line 34. Both the continent person and the temperate person are such as to do nothing contrary to reason for the sake of bodily pleasures. But the former has, and the latter has not, bad appetites, and the latter is such as not to feel pleasure contrary to reason, while the former is such as to feel pleasure, but not to be led by it. You're surely noticing here that perception and understanding play an essential role in Aristotle's account of the good life, of the life characterized by eudaimonia, that word commonly translated as happiness. If we live in a system of passions and desires, most happening within us, but also many influenced by external forces, we are the better for it if we have awareness of these passions and desires and can form proper assessments of them. Some passions and desires tend toward the good and virtuous life. Others tend toward a bad and blameworthy life. If we can identify which are which, perhaps we can learn to feed and encourage the passions and desires that are more conducive to the good life, while we also learn to prune or limit those which are conducive to destruction. In chapter 2, Aristotle takes us back to one of Socrates' ethical theories. Beginning of this chapter, Aristotle claims that according to Socrates, there is no such thing as incontinence. Incontinence here is the characteristic of the person who knows the good, yet doesn't do it. As a rationalist, Socrates believed that if a person truly knew the good thing to do, that meant the person would do that thing. The person said he knew the good, but did not do the good. That was a sign that the person did not truly know the good. Aristotle at 1145b, line 28, more or less, says that Socrates' view contradicts the apparent facts. It is possible to know the good and yet not do it. Part of what's going on with Socrates is that to deal with the apparent facts, he'll have to admit that not all who take themselves to know the good do in fact know the good. To instantiate Godwin's law, let's pick on Hitler. Hitler sincerely believed that killing all the Jews was a good thing. Acting on the belief that Jews were subhuman and a danger to the German people, he set up an apparatus that went a long way toward accomplishing what he himself took himself to know to be good. But he was wrong, deadly wrong. What do you think? Have you ever had the experience of taking yourself to know what is good, and yet your action did not align with that knowledge? Have you ever noticed, perhaps, that your will is, even by your own judgment, led astray or weakened by passions and desires? Or perhaps you felt desires in conflict within you. I can think of the times, too many, where I've had a strong desire, say, to eat the chocolate cake that is offered to me, and at the same time, a strong desire to be healthier. That is, to not eat the cake. We can start talking here about what some might call the meta level of meta desires, desires that are about desires. The temperate person wants to have desires that are healthy, desires that are directed at the right things in the right ways. The temperate person wants to have desires that are rightly ordered, among other desires. Some desires are perfectly fine, a normal part of the good life, but very much not so when they become central to life or crowd out other equally good choices, or even crowd out better desires. When I look at my own set of desires, a big, complicated set, I see some that I judge to be better than others, some that should be more central in my life, some less central. My current assessment of these desires is not exactly the same as it's always been. My hope is that as I mature, notice I'm assuming that maturation is possible and itself desirable, I'll more accurately assess and then order my desires. What do you think? First, where do you come down between Socrates and Aristotle? Do you think with the latter that incontinence is a possible state? Or are you like Socrates, a rationalist, one who thinks that the one who knows the good will do the good? Second, what do you think of the possibility of assessing and ordering desires? Have you had the experience of desiring certain desires in yourself to be either strengthened or weakened? Do you take yourself to have reliable and accurate tools at hand to guide you in your assessment of your desires? How might you gain and refine such tools? Near the beginning of chapter 7 at 1150a, line 17, Aristotle says, "Now since some pleasures are necessary, while others are not, and are necessary up to a point, while the excesses of them are not, nor the deficiencies, and this is equally true of appetites and pains, did you ever think about pleasures as being necessary? What are some examples of pleasures that you would reckon to be necessary? What characteristics make them necessary? What would be the effects of not having those pleasures?" One possibility for a necessary pleasure is eating. If we don't eat, we die. Eating food can be pleasurable, but do we need this pleasure to eat? Is thinking eating must be pleasurable a privilege of living in a wealthy country with plenty of food? I think here also of people I've known who lost the pleasure of eating and ended up wasting away. Maybe for at least some of us, at least some points in our life, eating must be pleasurable if we're going to do it. But maybe what's happening in this case is that our pleasure for living must be taken into account. If I lack the pleasure associated with being alive, say that I'm suffering from chronic pain, despair, loneliness, or depression, that lack of pleasure in being alive will impair and inhibit other related pleasures. Well, we can also carry this same example, the pleasures associated with eating, to Aristotle's mention of excesses and deficiencies. If we can get away with saying that the pleasure associated with eating is necessary, we can also say that though good, that pleasure can be deficient, either in terms of quantity or quality, or excessive, usually in terms of eating too much. We have a very strange claim at the beginning of chapter 11. Aristotle makes the claim that the study of pleasure and pain belongs to the province of the political philosopher, for he is the architect of the end, with a view to which we call one thing bad and another thing good without qualification. Are you familiar with the word anhedonia? It's the inability to feel pleasure. Anhedonia is not something Aristotle advocates. He thinks pleasure is good and necessary. It is a normal part of human life and a necessary part of the good life. That he would value pleasure is not the strange thing here. What's strange is that he says the study of pleasure and pain belongs to the province of the political philosopher. Is that a thought that has ever crossed your mind? I'll take a stab at what he might be thinking. If you have better ideas, I'd be happy for you to add your own analysis. If ethics is the inquiry into the nature of the good life and how to achieve it, you'll recognize here that this is my definition, not Aristotle's. Though I think it isn't too far different from his, then perhaps we can define political philosophy as the inquiry into the nature of the good life for us together in community and how to achieve it. The job of the political philosopher then is to investigate the goods we have together, that we share in, that depend on our being in community and produce goods for the people around us. I think I'm probably stretching Aristotle more with this definition than I do with my definition of ethics. What do you think? How does the definition and analysis of pleasure and pain bear on our life together in community?